Pam, tell me a little bit about what led you to all of your research, your book on the Underground Railroad. Was it always an interest of yours?
Well, my parents, when I was little, must have instilled in me a love and an interest in minorities, because I recall when I must have been 6 or 7 years old, I requested for Christmas not a white doll, but a black doll. I wanted an African American doll, but we lived in white communities up there, and I did not meet an African American until I went off to college. So there must have been something. I know my father was a pastor, and he had classmates from the seminary who were missionaries in Nigeria and different parts of Africa. And when they would be on furlough, they would come and often stay with us. And so they introduced me to stamp collecting. And through stamp collecting, then I could see these beautiful African scenes and African people on these gorgeous Tanzania stamps. And so I started somehow in my young life being interested in African people.
Interesting. So what led you to Underground Railroad then?
Well, when we moved down here in 1976, we moved because my husband got a job teaching philosophy at Indiana University Southeast. And one of the first things we did, we were always interested in history and in collecting and antiques, and we piled the kids in the car and we came downtown New Albany and saw all these wonderful Italianate buildings, and then we saw the Ohio River. I knew enough about African American history and about the Civil War that I was fascinated with the idea of, okay, so Kentucky was a slave state. There must have been slaves in Louisville, so how did they escape? If they did, how did they get across the river? And if they got into New Albany, why did they have to hide? And I started asking around in the community all these basic questions, and I wasn't getting any answers. In the African American community, now we're talking 25 years ago, maybe even longer ago than that, I started asking people, anywhere I could find people who would talk about it, what happened here in New Albany? And people were in denial. Well, the African American people said, we don't know, because our grandparents, our parents, nobody ever in our family talked about it. They wanted to look ahead. They wanted to look forward, not back at the painful history of slavery. I talked to people who should have been in the know about history of Floyd County, New Albany, and asked them questions too about who would have helped slaves over here. I don't think that it would have happened here. Underground Railroad, no, it couldn't have happened here.
Really?
Because we were building steamboats. Our whole economy centered on building steamboats and selling them to the southern market. And there was also involved in that, of course, a very strong anti-black bias, especially through John B. Norman, who was the editor of the New Albany Daily Ledger back then. He had terrible attitudes about races, and he propelled that information into the entire reading community. The New Albany, you remember, New Albany was the biggest community in the state of Indiana at that time. And so the newspaper was widely read. And
so one thing that's interesting, I'm just going to stop you because I want to just prod that a little bit more. Denial couldn't have happened here. What was that? Now it seems that we're really thirsting for what the truth was or is. Why the shift, and why weren't we there back in the 70s, do you think?
I think that people have become more interested in African American history. Maybe it's because of my book. I don't know, because that came out in 2001, that a lot of people would tell me, no, our history's been lost. But there were people out there starting to write books, and so, I think that there was a realization that no, it hasn't been lost. You just have to search. So that's part of it. But I think just generally speaking, I'm speaking here specifically about New Albany, I think that attitudes have been changing. We have preserved Division Street School, which was a segregated school, and half of our board is African American, half Caucasian. There are different things like that that have happened. The attention that's been drawn to Second Baptist Church, which is our town clock church, and now on the National Park Service Network to Freedom program. I think there's just more attention now drawn to the fact that, hey, the history of our community isn't just white.
Right.
The history of our community involves minorities too.
Do you think people are more open to the truth now and those hidden histories that we didn't know about?
I think so.
Yeah, it seems that we're changing, and
I do
we always
believe
go to
so.
that, there can't be reconciliation without the truth.
That's
and
right.
I keep coming back to that. So let's fast forward a little bit. So there was
Yeah.
a paper you did in 1996, and that kept, I guess, going with your knowledge and learning about the Underground Railroad.
Right. Sally Newkirk, who was director of the Carnegie Center for Art and History at that time, she was my go-to person, and still is actually. And she saw that I was finding stuff out. I would go to the library, and the first thing I did, with all this denial going on, I thought, okay, there are records in the paper today of people being arrested for various things and jailed. Maybe back then in the 1840s and 50s, the same thing was happening. Maybe if I start looking in the microfilm of our old newspapers, I will start seeing people being arrested for various reasons, maybe some for helping slaves get across the river. So that's really where my research started, and I went on for weeks, and I wouldn't find anything, and all of a sudden I'd see one little sentence. 2 slaves have been found in the Knobs, and the Louisville police were able to apprehend them and take them back across the river from whence they came.
So that's when so let me ask this question. Slave state, Kentucky, free state, Indiana, some would go, aren't you free when you get to Indiana?
Right.
No.
Well, you were technically free, but it's just that it wasn't safe, because slave catchers, sheriffs, owners could cross over state lines and pick their property up. And so it wasn't safe at all. And so slaves freedom seekers who found their way somehow across that river had to get out. They really didn't stay very long.
They couldn't stay in New Orleans.
And that's one of the reasons why so much of the information has been lost, and why we see a lot of records because they didn't stick around. So we see a lot of records in the newspaper of slaves being caught. That's when it would hit the newspaper.
Let me ask you about the Ohio River, because
Yeah.
there are narrow passages down toward New Albany.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular place that slaves seem to gravitate toward to cross into New Albany?
Well, there were certain reasons why the corridor between Louisville through Portland and New Albany were attractive, you might say, to slaves trying to search for freedom. One, of course, is the obvious one, the ferry. And they would get over on the ferry in many different ways. I'll just give you one example. Isaac Throgmorton was a slave owned by a man in New Orleans who would come up to Louisville for the summer, and Isaac was his personal barber. And he had a lot of freedom, and his owner trusted him. And on the streets of Louisville, he would get to know free people. He'd get to know other slaves, enslaved people. One of these free men asked him if he wanted to go over to New Albany fishing. And Isaac said, well, I can't do that. I don't have a paper. I don't have a freedom paper. I'm not legally supposed to go over there. And he said, I know the ferry operator. I'll help you. I'll assist you. So they got on the ferry, and Mr. Connor, the ferry operator from New Albany, his son, said, well, let me see your freedom paper. his friend said, he's with me. We're just going over fishing. We'll be coming right back. The son was used to seeing this other man.
Mm-hmm.
So they did that, and they went back to Louisville, and Isaac did it again. Finally, he did it by himself. After doing this several times, and the son getting to know him, and the father, Mr. Connor, getting to know him, they let him pass every time. Well, one time, Isaac decided, I'm not going back. He put his fishing pole on a tree, leaned it up on a tree, and as his testimony, once he did make it to Canada, and he was interviewed, and he said, I decided to take the cars to Jeffersonville, and then from Jeffersonville, he could connect north. And
Rail cars, obviously.
Railroad cars, and then he finally made it. After much trauma, he made it to safety in Canada.
And let's talk that safety in Canada, just because so many enslaved people ended up finding their freedom in Canada. Why did they go to Canada? Why?
They went to Canada because of the law there was that anyone could come to Canada and become a citizen, that slavery was forbidden there, and enslaved people became free once they got there.
So they didn't worry about past owners coming and getting them and trying to retrieve them. Canada was a haven.
Absolutely, it was a haven.
Let's go back to the Ohio River. So a ferry across. I've always heard that there's one area in particular where the land is closest together. Did that end up being a place where enslaved people might cross?
Well, if you're familiar with the golf course,
right,
I would say the most pristine area of Underground Railroad activity yet in Louisville is that shoreline where the golf course is. And it narrows there, but here's one of the things we have to remember. The Underground Railroad story was pretty much taken over by white people in the North and given credit to the white people. But in my research, and this was a real eye-opener for me being white, the big key to the Underground Railroad in New Albany and Louisville was the African American community. And if you study the census records, you realize that a good quarter, if not more, of the African American community worked on the river, either through working on the ferry system, the steamboats, as stewards, as musicians, as barbers, as firemen, as cabin workers, laundry people.
So there was a network.
There was an absolute network, plus a lot of them had their own little rowboats or skiffs. And one example of that is with Viola. This is a very touching story. And something must have happened in her life. She was an enslaved person. Her husband was owned by someone else, so the family was separated. They did not live together. This is a very sad story. She had 2 children that lived with her. Something ominous happened in her life. Probably the owner was getting older, and she was worried that he was going to be selling her or separating her children out to the southern market, which was demanding a lot of slave labor during the 1850s. Pardon?
Because of cotton?
Because of the cotton.
So it's sold downriver.
Absolutely. And so she hired a hack, that is a wagon. She hired a driver. She had saved up money. And this was a very frightening thing for her to do. She and her 2 children were taken to the area of the river that we're talking about there and watched for a skiff that was coming across the river from New Albany. But the night watchman in Portland heard the horse or saw their lantern. We don't know exactly what happened, but he ran over there and realized that these were enslaved people that were trying to reach for freedom, were running away, and he arrested them and took them back to the owner, and the owner took her immediately with the children to jail.
Oh.
So we do not know what happened to them. If he then couldn't trust them any longer and sold them down the river, we really don't know what happened. But it's one of those sad, sad stories of the Underground Railroad.
And I guess when you do that, I mean, you think of the courage, right? For this
Absolutely.
woman with her 2 children to do all of that.
Absolutely.
I guess that must resonate with you to all the way to the soul, to me, and heartbreaking stories. Just
Yes.
the complete sadness that comes with this history.
Absolutely. Well, talking about the river again, you mentioned it was narrow. So it was the ferry. It was the fact that it was a quieter area of Louisville. Jeffersonville, they had a ferry going from downtown Louisville, but the ferry operators were regularly turning in freedom seekers to the police in Louisville. It wasn't as safe. It was just easier to work around, as I told you about Isaac Throgmorton, work around the ferry operators. But it was the black community working on the river. It was being able to swim if they knew how to swim. And some people have told me there were sandbars down in that area, and you could somehow wade across. And I know that was true even farther downriver in the area in Harrison County, that you could often drive a wagon across it, depending on what was happening. Then there was the ice bridge. The river regularly froze, and often slaves would take that opportunity, as the newspaper said, to skedaddle across the river in search of freedom. And in fact, one newspaper article, Rachel, that I found said that slave owners were so worried about their slaves taking the ice bridge across into Indiana that they moved their slaves farther away from the shore into central Kentucky to keep them from running.
Let me ask you about, you've talked about some myths. Let's talk about the name Underground Railroad. Where did that come from? How did that get its name?
I hate to even use the term, to tell you the truth, because it just makes people want to think of hidey holes, hiding places, tunnels. We have to think up, not down. We have to think above, not under. It was people out there helping with food, clothing, shelter, transportation further north. It was people out there above ground doing the work.
Just a loose network that you knew who to call on. And how would you know this is a safe harbor? This is a person who will give me food or help?
It depended on your religious persuasion, on your political persuasion. You would find people who were willing to help runaway slaves, who had an anti-slavery abolitionist attitude about it, who hated slavery so much that they would risk whatever they could, their lives.
And did word get out on that?
And word would get out. For example, the church that we talked about, that is our Second Baptist Church, that was built by New School Presbyterians. New School Presbyterians were known for their anti-slavery, if not abolitionist, ideas. In fact, Dr. Clapp, Asahel Clapp, who was a renowned, in fact, nationally known doctor in New Albany, belonged to First Presbyterian, which was just a block and a half away, where New Albany Market is now. His servant, Amanda Finney, didn't go to church with him. She belonged to Second Presbyterian Church. And in studying the records at Hanover of that Second Presbyterian Church, the New School Presbyterian Church, I found other names of other African American people who belonged to that church. So even though it was thought of as a white Presbyterian church, there were African American members there, and that's one of the keys to that particular parish being helpful to African Americans who were looking for help.
So again, kind of that loose network, not necessarily hiding. It's I will give you food, we'll give you shelter, some of those kinds of things. How far did you have to get in Indiana before, I guess, enslaved people thought, okay, I've made it to freedom? I mean, you think free state, but it wasn't safe, you're saying, right around New Albany to stay there.
I'll tell you, it wasn't safe anywhere in Indiana. There are accounts of slave catchers going all the way to Canada looking for their freedom seeker. They wouldn't have called it freedom seeker. To them, it was a runaway slave. It was their property leaving. So it wasn't really safe anywhere, but it was particularly dangerous right along the border.
And tell me about Louisville, how much of a hub that was for slave trade.
It was a huge hub, a huge hub. I've had sources tell me that one of the reasons why Cincinnati grew so large and Louisville didn't was because the people who were coming in to settle the new regions were so aghast when they saw the slave pens with human merchandise right there, foot of 2nd Street Bridge, on Liberty. There were big dealers, and then there were small dealers that sold just people. But it was just a horrendous thing for people moving in from the east, from the anti-slavery states, to see people being sold right on the street. It was also a hub because of what we've been talking about with the area being with African American community on both sides of the river, communicating with each other through their occupation. It was a place that they knew they could cross more easily than other places. So
the human spirit, what you've learned about the human spirit in this, the negative and the positive.
Well, it's something that if I think back to my own life, it was instilled in me early on by my parents. A love for and an interest in people in need. And through my study of the Presbyterians, for example, they were all good people. The old school First Presbyterian Church, they were good people too. And although they probably hated the idea of slavery, they weren't willing to sacrifice everything the way the New School people were. The pastors at the New School Church, Second Presbyterian, all preached out there anti-slavery sermons. That was a very brave thing for them to do in a place like New Albany, which had this very strong anti-black bias. And it just, a subject like helping the needy in a case like we're talking about is just brings out the worst and the best in people. And the New School Presbyterians were willing to step out and help with food and clothing. We have examples of that. They got by it with the anti-black newspaper by establishing missions out along the river where the slaves were coming across. That was how they got by with it. It was put under the topic of Christian benevolency. They were teaching them reading, writing, Bible stories, which were all a way to freedom,
and
a way to help them to freedom. But they were doing it above ground, let's put it that way.
Right.
They were doing it above ground out there where the public could see it. They were criticized by the newspaper for doing it, but they got by with it and got around the law in that way because it was put under the guise of Christian benevolency, you might say.
Give me two more myths that you want people to know about the Underground Railroad. First and foremost, you said that it was mostly white lead. That was not the case.
That was not the case. Another one, of course, is the idea that slaves hid in tunnels or hiding places under the ground. I spent about a year searching out different houses in New Albany, particularly along Main Street, and the church itself, which has signs of a tunnel going from the front door under Main Street. There was a tunnel there. It is now blocked up, but most of these tunnels in town were either for wine cellars, food storage, cold food storage, probably during Prohibition, there was some activity that went on under the ground. The tunnel, for example, that goes from the church under Main Street to what was a hotel across the street was built for human passage, but it was built for the gas lines, which went in about 1852. The gas lines were under the ground, and there's an article in one of the histories of New Albany that talk about the fact that they had to put in the gas lines to all the public buildings, all the churches, all of that original grid that was in New Albany. And so it had to be for human passage because the people had to go down, the workers had to go down there and make adjustments to the gas lines.
Passages to freedom.
Right. And so it's easy for us to project our own thoughts on what the Underground Railroad was. And it's easy for us when there is a tunnel right there in this church, in this facility that has an oral tradition and a link to the Underground Railroad. It's easy to project our thoughts on the fact that the tunnel was used. Maybe it was. We don't have any record of that. We do have a record of the people in that congregation being anti-slavery or abolitionist and for helping African Americans when they were coming across the river, especially during the end of the Civil War. But we don't have any record of anybody using that tunnel to go across Main Street. And so, we just have to use it as a teaching moment when students come down there, and we have to tell them the difference between oral tradition and actual historic record, historical research. And just use it as a teaching moment.
Give me one other name you want us to know from your research, a particular story that really struck you, another name that we should know that we might not.
Well, there was a leader in the African American community in Louisville by the name of Cunningham. He was a musician, worked on the riverboats, and he and several of the other leaders went up to Pittsburgh back in the 1850s, I think it was 1853, to one of Frederick Douglass's, to an African American conference. And he subscribed to Frederick Douglass's North Star. He brought it home to Louisville, and he would read it, and his other friends would read it. Then he would slip it on top of the piano, under the piano music. Meanwhile, one of the stewards who worked on that same riverboat and lived next to George Washington Carter, who was a leader in the Underground Railroad, I believe, and he was a neighbor of his, and he would find it under the music, take it back to Louisville, and the African American men there would read the North Star, and then he'd take it back to the boat, slip it under the music. It was dangerous on both sides of the river for African Americans to meet, and it was just something that they didn't want to get into trouble for, but they probably would have had authorities found the North Star.
What happened to him? Do you know?
Cunningham, he was often arrested but let go on. The newspaper said good behavior. He is buried in Eastern Cemetery. There's very little left in New Albany of Underground Railroad sites. One of them is Eastern Cemetery, where a lot of these African American people, leaders in the community, were buried. And the other is the area, that strip of land around the golf course area that we talked about. That's still a very pristine area where slaves would try to get across the river.
What is your hope for people who might be watching this about learning more and why this history is important?
I think that the big thing and the big eye-opener for me was how involved the African American community was on both sides of the river. Because, normally you think Quakers, you think white people were the leaders in this movement. But that was the big eye-opener for me, that no, it was the free people working with free people and slaves in Louisville on both sides of the river, even if it was just merely looking the other way. There's a story about a slave woman who got across the river, went to West Union, and lived with a family for about 3 months. She was out in the yard one day when her owner, she even married, and her owner came around on a buggy, horse and buggy, and saw her, went back to Louisville the next day, came over without any papers, court papers or anything, was able to take her back to Louisville as his slave. And it frightened our free people to the extent that many of them left town because they were feared for their own lives. There was a lot of kidnapping and that kind of thing that went on too of free people. So that's I guess the big thing that I take away from my study of the Underground Railroad was African American community involvement in helping freedom seekers to find their freedom.
And the final word of the courage and the power it must have taken for them. I can't even fathom it.
Absolutely, we can't. But it was like, freedom to them was like a pot of gold. And that's, if I could just get across the river, if I can see that steeple, I can see that church from here on my side of the river. If I could just get over there, I know there are people there who would help me. Freedom to them was like a pot of gold, and they would do anything if they had the courage and the fortitude to do it. So it's just something that is hard for us to comprehend what that would be like.
Thank you for sharing and
You're
all your
welcome.
research.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.